Okay, so hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive.
It's great to be here.
All right, so today we're diving into something super interesting.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a challenge actually that someone threw at us.
A good one, though.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Trying to map out what the global economy is going to look like as we head towards 2025.
Right. And specifically where Vietnam fits into all of that.
Exactly. And we've got a whole pile of reports and forecasts here, economic stuff.
A lot to dig through.
Yeah, and our goal is to sift through all that and try to extract the most important insights.
The stuff that really matters.
Yeah, so we can give you a clear picture of what's probably going to happen in the world economy, and especially for Vietnam.
And why it matters to people listening,
Exactly, because it does have an impact on all of us.
Absolutely.
So to make it a bit easier to grasp, we're going to focus on two key things: GDP growth.
That's the big picture, how much the economy is growing overall.
Right. Basically the health of the economy.
Ex-
And then CPI, which tells us about inflation, you know, how fast prices are rising.
Yeah, so we're not going to just throw a bunch of numbers at you. Don't worry.
We want to make this digestible
Yeah, we're going to try to pull out the crucial information and explain it in a way that makes sense.
so you can understand what's going on and why it's relevant to your life.
That's the goal.
Okay, so when you look at these reports, globally, what's the first thing that jumps out at you?
Well, it seems like globally things are expected to grow steadily, but maybe not as fast as we've seen in the past.
Okay.
So for both 2024 and 2025, the projection for global GDP growth is around 2.7%.
So not a huge number.
No, and actually figure H1 in our source material shows that this is pretty similar to what we saw in 2023.
Okay, so consistent but not super exciting.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is when you compare this to the average growth rate from before the pandemic,
Yeah.
from like 2011 to 2019,
Right.
back then growth was generally higher.
So it's like the world economy is still expanding, but it's definitely lost some of its momentum.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so why is that? Why are we seeing this slower growth? Is it like a hangover from the pandemic or something?
Well, it's not just one thing, it's a bunch of factors coming together.
Oh, I see. Like a perfect storm.
Yeah, kind of. The reports highlight a few key things that are holding back growth.
Okay, like what?
One big one is all the geopolitical conflicts happening around the world.
Right. There's a lot of tension out there.
Yeah, and that creates uncertainty, which makes businesses hesitant to invest in trade.
Makes sense.
Another factor is the increasing tension around trade and technology.
Ah, yeah, we hear about that all the time.
It's leading to what some people are calling economic fragmentation.
Meaning what exactly?
It basically means that the world is becoming less interconnected economically.
Like countries are turning inward,
Right, and we're seeing a rise in protectionist policies.
where countries are trying to shield their own industries.
Exactly, and figure H6 in the source material actually shows how these trade policy risks are increasing.
So it's not just about natural economic cycles. There are some serious external pressures at play too.
Yeah, definitely.
And on top of the slower growth, we've got to consider what's happening with prices.
Right, absolutely. That's where CPI comes in.
Right, inflation.
Exactly. Figure H1 also shows that global inflation is expected to ease a bit.
So that's good news, right?
Definitely, the Consumer Price Index CPI is projected to be around 3.4% on average for 2024.
Okay.
And then it's expected to drop down to 2.9% in 2025.
So prices will still be going up, but not as quickly.
Right, and that's partly because central banks around the world have been taking action to try and control inflation.
Like raising interest rates.
Exactly.
So are we seeing any changes in interest rates globally?
Yeah, it looks like global interest rates are expected to gradually decrease over the next few years.
Oh, interesting. So after all those interest rate hikes to fight inflation,
Right, central banks are likely to start easing monetary policy a little bit.
meaning making it cheaper to borrow money.
Exactly. It's a way to support economic activity as inflation cools down.
So just to recap the global picture so far,
Okay.
we're looking at slower economic growth, but some relief from high inflation
Right.
and possibly lower borrowing costs in the future.
Sounds about right.
Now, one thing I noticed in the reports is that there's a lot of talk about increased public investment.
Yeah, that caught my eye too.
So where is all that money going and why is it important?
Well, it seems like governments around the world are realizing that they need to invest in certain areas to ensure future growth.
Okay, like what?
One big area is infrastructure.
Roads, bridges, communication networks, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. They need to be upgraded and modernized.
Makes sense.
And then there's also a lot of investment going into the green transition.
Renewable energy, environmental sustainability,
Right. It's becoming a major focus.
which is great to see.
Yeah. And we're also seeing a push towards investment in digital technologies.
like AI and semiconductors.
Exactly. These are all areas that are seen as crucial for future economic growth and competitiveness.
So it's like investing now for future gains.
That's the idea.
Okay, so let's shift our focus to Vietnam now,
Okay.
because when it comes to growth, Vietnam seems to be a bit of an outlier compared to the global picture.
Yeah, definitely.
It's actually quite a contrast.
It is.
So the reports show that Vietnam's projected GDP growth for 2024 and 2025 is really strong.
It is. They're forecasting some impressive numbers.
Yeah, so after seeing 8.12% growth in 2022 and a still respectable 5.1% in 2023.
Which is already pretty good.
Yeah, the estimate for 2024 is a robust 7.09%.
Wow, that's a big jump.
And then for 2025, the forecast is even higher, somewhere between 8 and 8.5%.
That's incredible.
I know, right? And if you look at Table 1 and Table 2 in the source material,
Okay.
you can see just how much Vietnam's projected growth outpaces the average for developing Asia and many other countries in the region.
Yeah, it's really standing out.
So what's driving this impressive performance? What's Vietnam doing differently?
Well, it seems like a combination of factors are at play.
Okay, like what?
Domestic consumption is recovering, so people in Vietnam are spending more. And there's also strong external demand for Vietnamese goods.
Ah, so exports are doing well.
Yes, although there's a little note here that suggests export growth might moderate slightly in early 2025.
Okay, we'll have to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, figure H.10 shows a bit more detail on that.
Okay, but overall, it sounds like Vietnam has a lot of positive momentum.
It does. Private investment is rebounding. There's a significant inflow of foreign direct investment, FDI.
That's when companies from other countries invest in Vietnam, right?
Exactly. And Table 2 and Table 3 actually show how much FDI Vietnam has been attracting.
Ah.
And then you've got positive remittances.
That's money sent back home by Vietnamese people working abroad.
Right. And the government is also actively promoting public investment, especially in infrastructure projects.
So it's like a multi-pronged approach to boosting the economy.
Yeah, they're hitting it from all angles.
But what about inflation in Vietnam? I mean, we saw that globally inflation is expected to ease.
Right.
So is Vietnam following that trend?
Well, interestingly, Vietnam's CPI has actually been creeping up a bit.
Oh, okay.
So it was 3.2% in 2022, then 3.3% in 2023.
So a slight increase.
Yeah, and the estimate for 2024 is 3.63%.
Okay, and what about 2025?
The forecast for 2025 is somewhere between 4 and 4.5%.
So a bit higher than the global average.
It is, but the source material suggests that this level is still considered manageable for the Vietnamese economy.
Okay, so it's something to watch, but not necessarily a major concern right now.
Right.
Figure H9, by the way, shows how CPI has been trending year on year if you want to see the visual.
Yeah, that's helpful for getting a clearer picture.
So it's interesting that Vietnam is experiencing faster growth than the global average, but also slightly higher inflation.
It's a bit of a trade-off.
Yeah, but what are some of the underlying strengths of the Vietnamese economy that allow for this robust growth even with higher inflation?
Well, the reports emphasize that Vietnam has some really solid macroeconomic foundations.
Okay, that's good to hear.
And they've also improved their risk management in recent years.
So they're being proactive.
Exactly, and that includes things like keeping inflation relatively under control.
Even though it's ticking up a bit.
Right, and maintaining relatively low interest rates.
So borrowing isn't too expensive,
Exactly, and they're seeing healthy growth in lending.
meaning banks are lending money to businesses and consumers
Yeah, and they're also actively managing the exchange rate of their currency.
to make sure it stays stable.
Right, and they're keeping an eye on the level of bad debts in the financial system.
So they're managing risks effectively.
Yeah, and on top of all that, the Vietnamese stock market is recovering,
That's always a good sign.
and the real estate sector is gradually improving as well.
So a lot of positive signals.
Yeah, these underlying factors provide a pretty stable base for continued economic expansion.
That's great to hear. Are there any particular sectors within Vietnam that are like shining stars that are showing really strong potential for future growth?
Oh, definitely. There's a big push towards developing the digital economy in Vietnam.
Makes sense, the world is going digital.
Exactly, and they're also promoting a green and circular economy.
So focusing on sustainability and resource efficiency.
Yeah, and that's getting a lot of attention and investment.
And then, of course, there's the energy transition, moving towards cleaner sources of energy. So it seems like Vietnam is really aligning its economic development strategy with global trends.
They are. They're looking towards the future.
And Vietnam's engagement with the rest of the world seems to be a key part of its growth strategy too, right?
Oh, absolutely. They're very active in international trade.
And they've been really good at capitalizing on those shifts in global supply chains.
Right, as companies look for alternative manufacturing locations.
Vietnam has been ready to step in,
Yeah, they're well positioned.
and they've also been upgrading their strategic partnerships with several key countries.
Which opens up more opportunities for trade, investment, and technology transfer.
So this outward-looking approach is definitely working in Vietnam's favor.
It is.
Okay, before we get into the numbers, I just want to touch on one more thing.
Go ahead.
The reports mention some ongoing institutional reforms in Vietnam.
Yeah, they're trying to improve the business environment.
So what kind of changes are happening?
Well, one example is the revised land law.
Okay.
They're trying to streamline processes related to land use and ownership.
Which can be a big hurdle for businesses sometimes.
It can. These kinds of reforms are really important for making Vietnam a more attractive and competitive place to do business.
And that's crucial for long-term sustainable growth.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's dive into some of the specifics now.
Okay, let's do it.
So figure H7 shows Vietnam's GDP growth broken down by how things are produced, the different sectors of the economy.
Right, so it shows where the growth is coming from.
Exactly. And this is for the period between 2019 and 2024.
Okay.
So it's basically divided into three main areas: agriculture, forestry, and fishing, then industry and construction, and then services.
Makes sense.
And by looking at this breakdown over time, you can see which sectors have been the main drivers of growth in different years.
Right, like sometimes manufacturing and construction might be leading the way.
And other times it might be the services sector, which includes things like tourism, retail, and finance.
Exactly.
So this sectoral view gives us a good understanding of how the structure of the Vietnamese economy is changing over time.
Yeah, it's a really useful perspective.
And then figure H8 looks at GDP growth from a different angle.
How so?
It shows how the money's actually spent.
Ah, okay, so it's looking at GDP growth through the lens of expenditure.
Exactly.
Interesting.
So it breaks down how the total economic output is used,
Okay.
like how much is spent on asset accumulation, which is basically investment in things like factories and equipment,
Right.
and then how much is spent on final consumption by households and the government.
Okay.
And then there's the trade balance, which is the difference
Yeah.
between Vietnam's exports and imports.
So this perspective tells us where the demand in the economy is coming from.
Exactly.
So if final consumption is growing strongly, it means domestic demand from consumers is healthy. And if the trade balance is positive, it means Vietnam is exporting more than it's importing.
Which is usually a good thing.
It can be.
So these are really useful ways to understand the underlying drivers of economic growth.
They are.
Okay, so let's fast forward a bit now.
Okay.
We have some early data from the first 2 months of 2025 in Table 3.
So this is like a sneak peek into how the year is starting.
Exactly.
I'm curious to see what it says.
Well, the estimated GDP growth for the first quarter of 2025 is projected to be pretty strong,
How strong are we talking?
somewhere between 7.8% and 8.2%.
Wow, so they're keeping up the momentum.
It seems so. And on the inflation front, the 2-month average CPI for this period is forecast at 3.27%.
Okay, so that's actually slightly lower than the 3.67% we saw in the same period of 2024.
Yeah, figure H9 and Table 3 have the details on that.
So it seems like inflation might be easing up a bit at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, which is good news.
It is.
Now, what about industrial production? The manufacturing sector is a big driver of Vietnam's exports.
Right.
So is it maintaining its momentum?
It looks like it is the Industrial Production Index IIP growth is positive in the early months of 2025.
It's good to hear.
Yeah, Table 2 and Table 3 have the numbers, and Figure H10 shows the trend.
Okay.
The overall forecast for industrial production growth in 2025 is between 8% and 10%.
So a solid performance.
Yeah, and the data from the first 2 months suggests that they're on track to meet those targets.
Now, what about Vietnamese consumers? Are they still spending?
It seems like their retail sales of goods and services are still growing at a healthy pace.
That's a good sign.
It is Table 2, Table 3, and Figure H15 all show.
Yeah.
The data for the first 2 months of 2025 shows a 9.4% increase compared to the same period last year.
Wow. So consumer confidence seems to be high.
Yeah, and the outlook for consumer spending for the rest of the year is pretty optimistic.
That's great to hear. Now let's talk about trade, because Vietnam's economy is very open.
Right, exports and imports are crucial.
Exactly. So what do the early 2025 figures tell us?
Well, if you look at Table 2 and Table 3 and figures H10 and H11,
Okay.
you can see the export and import numbers for the first 2 months of 2025.
Endless story.
Exports are still growing, but figure H10 does suggest that the rate of growth might be slowing down a bit.
Interesting.
And imports are also increasing, which is normal in a growing economy.
Right, businesses need to import raw materials and equipment, and consumers want more goods.
Exactly, but importantly, the trade balance is still positive.
Meaning Vietnam is still exporting more than it's importing.
Right, Table 3 shows that.
Okay, so that's a good sign. Now, what about foreign investment? Are companies still pouring money into Vietnam?
It seems like they're both registered FDI and realized FDI are still looking strong.
Just to remind everyone, registered FDI is the amount that companies have committed to investing.
Right, and realized FDI is the amount that has actually been invested.
Okay.
So Table 2 and Table 3 show that registered FDI actually jumped significantly in the first 2 months of 2025 compared to last year.
Wow, that's a big vote of confidence.
It is, and realized FDI is also showing positive growth.
So investors are following through on their commitments.
They are.
Okay, so last question on these early indicators.
Shoot.
What's happening with credit growth? How much banks are lending?
Okay.
And what about the stability of the Vietnamese currency, the exchange rate?
Okay, so Table 2 and Table 3 and Figure H16 have the details on that.
Okay.
Credit growth is still positive, which is good.
It means businesses and consumers can still get loans.
Right, and the exchange rate of the Vietnamese dong against the US dollar has been relatively stable.
So no wild swings.
Not really. It seems like they're managing it effectively.
Okay, so let's move on to Vietnam's trading partners.
Sounds good.
Figure H11 shows who the key players are in early 2025.
Okay.
So who are the biggest names?
Well, China and the USA are definitely the major partners for both exports and imports.
As usual.
Yeah, they're the big ones. And then you've got the Asian countries, South Korea, the European Union, and Japan.
So a mix of regional and global partners.
Exactly. And it's interesting to see how the growth rates in trade with each of these partners can vary.
Yeah, it reflects the different economic conditions in each of those countries.
Right. And it also shows how Vietnam's trade relationships with each of them are unique.
Makes sense. Now, Figure H12 gives us a broader perspective on Vietnam's commodity trade partners for all of 2024.
Okay, so it shows where Vietnam was sending its goods and where it was getting its imports from.
Exactly. And what were the main takeaways from that?
Well, for exports, the United States was the biggest destination,
Okay.
followed by the European Union and then China.
So a pretty diverse mix.
It is. And on the import side, China was the biggest source by far.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, followed by South Korea and then the ASEAN countries.
So this really highlights how important these key regions are for Vietnam's overall trade flows.
It does.
Okay, now let's talk about investment within Vietnam.
Sure.
Figure H13 breaks down investment by sector for the period between 2019 and 2024.
So it shows which parts of the economy have been attracting the most investment.
Exactly. And although we don't have all the specific details here,
Right.
this kind of figure would typically show whether it's manufacturing services, real estate, agriculture, which sectors have been the most popular.
Yeah, and how those patterns have changed over time.
And that can tell us a lot about where the growth potential is seen to be.
And also which areas are getting specific policy support from the government.
Right. So it's a good indicator of where the economy is headed.
It is?
And then Figure H14 tracks the disbursement of public investment.
Meaning how quickly the government is actually spending the money they've allocated for projects.
Exactly. And this is important because it shows how effectively the government is implementing its plans.
Right. If they're slow to disperse funds, it can delay crucial projects.
And that can hinder economic development.
And it can also reduce the overall impact of government spending.
So keeping an eye on disbursement rates is crucial.
Definitely.
Okay, let's talk about the stock market for a minute. Figure H17 shows that the Vietnamese stock market has seen a really nice recovery and increase in 2024 and early 2025.
Yeah, those are some impressive gains.
And this reflects the positive economic sentiment we've been talking about, right?
Absolutely. Investors are feeling confident about Vietnam's prospects.
And that's driven by the strong economic outlook, improving corporate earnings, and the overall stability of the macroeconomic environment.
All good things.
And Figure H18 actually breaks down those changes in stock prices by industry sector.
So we can see which parts of the economy are really exciting investors.
Exactly. And without going into all the specifics,
Right.
sectors like telecommunications, information technology, and maybe consumer-related industries like tourism and entertainment,
Okay.
those might be the ones showing particularly strong growth.
So those are the areas to watch.
It seems so. Okay, so we've painted a pretty optimistic picture of Vietnam's economic outlook so far.
We have.
But we have to be realistic.
Of course.
There are always risks and challenges to consider. So what are some of the key ones that the reports identify for 2024 and 2025?
Well, on the external front, the geopolitical tensions and trade and technology conflicts we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
those are still big concerns for Vietnam.
They could definitely have an impact on exports, foreign investment, even tourism,
Right. And then there are the global risks like cybersecurity threats and climate change.
which affect everyone, of course.
Yeah, but they can still pose specific challenges for Vietnam.
Okay, so those are the external risks.
Yeah.
What about internal challenges within Vietnam itself?
Well, one thing the reports point out is that while overall consumption is strong,
Right.
private investment is still lagging behind pre-COVID levels.
Mm. So businesses aren't investing as much as they used to.
Yeah, and that could hold back future growth if it doesn't pick up.
Okay. And we also talk about those early signs of a slowdown in export growth in early 2025.
Right, Figure H10 showed that.
So that's something to keep an eye on.
Definitely.
And then there's the issue of public investment disbursement,
It can be slow and uneven sometimes.
which can delay important projects.
Exactly.
And on top of all that, a lot of businesses in Vietnam are still facing difficulties.
Like what?
Well, there's the ongoing trade and technology uncertainties,
Right.
and then they're also dealing with high costs for inputs and logistics.
Which can squeeze their profits.
And the recovery in orders from overseas isn't always consistent or sustainable.
So it's hard for them to plan ahead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's the increasing pressure to digitalize and adopt greener technologies.
Which can be costly and challenging for some businesses.
Yeah, especially for smaller ones.
Right.
Are there any other bigger structural issues that Vietnam needs to address?
Well, the restructuring of state-owned enterprises is still ongoing,
Okay.
and it's a bit of a slow process.
And some of the weaker credit institutions also need to be strengthened.
Right.
And although it's being managed well right now, there's always a risk that exchange rates could become more volatile.
Yeah, and bad debts in the financial system could start to rise.
And the corporate bond market still has some risks attached to it.
Right.
And the recovery in the real estate market is happening slowly and with high prices, which makes housing less affordable for people.
Yeah, that's a concern.
And then there's the development of new laws and institutions to support emerging areas like the digital economy, the green economy, the circular economy, all that stuff.
Right.
It's taking time to get all that in place.
Yeah, and there are also some organizational streamlining efforts that are still in progress.
So it's a work in progress.
It is, but they're making progress.
Okay, so let's zoom in on one specific external factor that could have a big impact on Vietnam.
Okay, what's that?
The policies of the United States.
Ah, yeah, that's a big one.
Tables 4 and 5 in the source material talk about the potential positive and negative effects of U.S. foreign and economic policies on Vietnam.
Okay.
And they specifically focus on the policies of a potential Trump administration.
So let's break that down. What are the main points?
So Table 4 summarizes the potential impacts in general.
Okay.
And on the positive side, increased demand for Vietnamese exports in the U.S. and other markets.
That could happen if companies are looking for alternatives to China.
Right, and the trend of investment and supply chain shifts away from other regions.
Yeah, Vietnam could benefit from that.
And there's also the possibility of increased cooperation between the U.S. and Vietnam in specific sectors.
Like energy and technology.
Exactly. So those are the potential upsides.
Okay, but what about the downsides?
Well, there's some significant risks too.
Like what?
One is the possibility of increased global inflation and interest rates,
Right. If the U.S. raises rates, it could have a ripple effect around the world.
and that could delay those interest rate cuts that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, that would be a setback,
And then there's the risk of heightened trade protectionism from the U.S.
which could directly or indirectly harm Vietnamese exports.
Exactly. And then there's this thing about currency manipulation.
Meaning?
The U.S. might accuse Vietnam of manipulating its currency to gain an unfair trade advantage.
Ah, I see. And that could lead to trade friction.
Exactly. And then finally, stricter U.S. immigration controls could affect tourism and the number of Vietnamese students studying in the U.S.
So those are some serious potential downsides.
They are. Now, Table 5 gets into some specific tariff policies that the U.S. might implement.
Okay, so what are those?
Well, they're talking about potential tariffs on goods from Mexico and Canada.
Oh, wow.
And also further tariffs on imports from China.
So not directly targeting Vietnam?
No, but those policies could still have a big indirect impact.
How so?
Well, think about it. If global trade patterns are disrupted
Right.
and other countries start retaliating with their own tariffs,
Yeah,
it could create a really uncertain and volatile environment for Vietnam.
makes sense.
And it could also impact Vietnam's supply chains and its competitiveness in international markets.
Like, if tariffs on Chinese goods increase and Vietnam uses Chinese components in its exports.
Right? Those exports would suddenly become more expensive.
Yeah, that would be a problem.
And figure H20 actually tries to model the impact of these U.S. tariff policies on the global economy.
So what does it predict?
Well, it looks at two main scenarios.
Okay.
One is where the U.S. just imposes the tariffs,
Yeah.
and there's no major retaliation.
Okay.
And even in that case, the model predicts that global economic growth will be negatively impacted.
And inflation will rise.
Exactly. And then the second scenario looks at what happens if other countries retaliate with their own tariffs.
Which seems likely.
Yeah. And in that case, the model predicts even worse outcomes for global growth and inflation.
So no matter what, it's not looking good.
Not really.
Yeah.
And the figure also shows the predicted impacts on specific economies like Mexico, Canada, and China.
And although Vietnam isn't specifically included in the model,
Right, yeah.
these global and regional impacts would definitely affect Vietnam too.
Yeah, it would make the whole environment for trade and investment much more challenging.
It would.
So to sum up the potential impact of these U.S. policies on Vietnam,
Okay.
it's a mix of opportunities and challenges.
Right.
On the opportunity side, there's the chance that Vietnam could grab some market share from other countries that are hit by U.S. tariffs.
Okay.
And the shift in supply chains away from China could also benefit Vietnam.
Yeah.
But on the challenge side, there's the risk of decline in Vietnam's overall exports if global demand weakens.
Right.
And FDI could also be affected if global policy uncertainty increases.
And if the U.S. starts offering more incentives for companies to invest domestically.
Exactly. And then there's an increased risk of trade protectionism and investigations into Vietnam's trade practices.
Yeah, that's a worry.
And logistics costs could go up, and exchange rates and interest rates could become more volatile.
So a lot of potential headaches.
Yeah, and the source material actually estimates that in the baseline scenario, increased U.S. tariffs could add an extra $4 billion in costs for Vietnamese goods exported to the U.S.
Wow, that's a significant amount.
It is. And to see which specific sectors would be most vulnerable,
Okay.
take a look at Table 6.
What does that show?
It lists the top 10 export items from Vietnam to the U.S. in 2024.
All right.
And some of the big ones are computers, electronic products and components, machinery and equipment, textiles and garments, and wood products.
So those are the ones that would be hit hardest by any tariff increases.
Yeah, because they make up a big chunk of Vietnam's exports to the U.S.,
Right. Any changes in U.S. policy could make those goods more expensive.
which could reduce demand and hurt Vietnam's export earnings.
Yeah, that's a real concern.
Okay, so to wrap things up,
Okay.
we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We've looked at the global economic outlook for 2025,
Right.
and we've zoomed in on Vietnam's economic prospects.
Focusing on GDP growth and CPI.
Exactly. And the main takeaway is that while Vietnam is projected to see strong growth, it's operating within a global context of more moderate expansion and some persistent risks.
Definitely.
So Vietnam is doing well, but it's not immune to global headwinds.
Not at all.
And we've seen how policy shifts in major economies like the United States can have ripple effects around the world.
Absolutely.
Now, it's a complex and ever-changing landscape.
It is.
So my question to you is this.
Okay.
Given all these economic forces and potential policy changes,
Right.
what strategic adjustments do you think individuals and businesses in Vietnam need to be thinking about?
To navigate both the opportunities and the challenges that lie ahead?
Because these big macroeconomic trends we've been talking about,
Yeah.
they really do have an impact on all of us.
They do. They affect our daily.